The morning sun spilled over the terracotta rooftops of Al-Mazra, a small yet thriving city where tradition met ambition at every corner. In the heart of its old market district stood Rahman and Sons General Traders, a family shop that had been a landmark for nearly 4 decades. Its wooden signboard, faded by years of dust and heat, still carried the pride of its founder, a man whose values had built both a business and a reputation. When her mother married again, Alina had been only 16. Her stepfather was a respected businessman, calm but strict, and his son, her new stepbrother, was a young man with charm and entitlement in equal measure. The two step-siblings had grown up under the same roof but never shared the same warmth. Alina was disciplined, observant, and quietly ambitious. Her stepbrother, Rayan, was reckless, confident, and obsessed with shortcuts to success. Years later, when the family shop expanded into a larger supply business, Alina had already earned a business degree and returned to take a senior role in operations. Rayan, meanwhile, dabbled in startups that never lasted more than a year. Still, his father adored him and believed that one day he would find his way. When her stepfather's health began to fail, Alina naturally stepped up. The staff looked to her for direction, and the suppliers trusted her decisiveness. Under her watch, the shop modernized its inventory systems, secured government supply contracts, and became a stable enterprise. For the first time, Rahman and Sons had a woman as its general manager, something that stirred quiet gossip in the market, but undeniable results on paper. Yet, beneath the surface of growth and calm, a silent feud was forming. Rayan had always felt overshadowed by her competence. To him, Alina represented a threat, not just to his position in the family business but to his identity. He wanted control, and to get it, he would have to undermine her authority and seize what he believed was his birthright. What Alina didn't know was that Rayan had already started plotting. Through an old family friend who worked in the property records office, he began searching for loopholes in the business's land lease. The shop stood on leased commercial land, prime property whose renewal was due within the year. If he could gain control of that land, the entire business would fall into his hands, regardless of the company's internal structure. Meanwhile, Alina remained immersed in day-to-day operations, unaware that her stepbrother was preparing to move against her. The old shop that had once been the heart of family unity was now becoming the center of silent warfare. The father's health continued to deteriorate, and his ability to oversee matters faded. Rayan, seeing the opportunity, began whispering into his father's ear small complaints about Alina's control, about staff disrespect, about decisions being made without him. He painted himself as the loyal son trying to protect the family legacy from being hijacked. But Alina wasn't blind to tension. She noticed unusual accounting delays, missed supplier payments, and small inconsistencies in expense reports. Someone was tampering with records. Her instinct told her that this wasn't ordinary mismanagement. As the year turned, the municipal authorities announced that the land leases for several market blocks would soon be renewed through open bidding. The news spread quickly among shop owners, but Rayan already knew. He had used his father's old connections to gain early access to the list. Rahman and Sons was on it. While the family argued about priorities and care routines for their ailing father, Rayan quietly prepared to bid for the land under the company's very foundation. By the time Alina discovered that the lease renewal was approaching, the paperwork had already begun to move, not under her signature, but through forged authorizations and stamped letters that bore her name. She didn't yet know how deep the forgery ran, nor how close the betrayal stood. But her instincts whispered that something was wrong, something that could shatter both the business and the family it represented. As the old year ended and a new one began, Alina stood before the shop late one evening. The lights flickered, the shutters creaked, and the streets outside echoed with the hum of closing stalls. She felt a chill not from the wind, but from the growing sense that the real storm was just beginning. The dawn crept over Al-Mazra with the muted hum of commerce awakening, carts rattling across cobblestones, shutters lifting, and the scent of roasted coffee drifting through narrow streets. Inside Rahman and Sons General Traders, Alina was already at her desk before the staff arrived. The shop's upper floor had been converted into an office over the years, modest, but organized, lined with dusty filing cabinets and framed photographs of her stepfather with loyal employees. She poured herself tea and began reviewing quarterly expense summaries, but something felt off. The payment logs for warehouse rent showed inconsistencies, overlapping months, mismatched check numbers, and a lease receipt dated weeks before it should have been processed. At first, she thought it was clerical error. But as she traced the entries backward, a pattern emerged. Multiple authorizations bore her signature, or at least, what looked like it. Her pulse quickened. The handwriting was nearly identical, but the pen pressure, the curvature of certain letters, they were wrong. Someone had imitated her signature with precision, and not just once. There were at least 6 documents with forgeries. Alina leaned back, her eyes fixed on the paper. She knew immediately what this meant. Someone had used her authority to execute decisions she never approved. One of the forged letters was addressed to the Municipal Property Authority, requesting early renewal of the land lease under the business name, but the contact number listed was not the company's. It belonged to a private mobile number she didn't recognize. The discovery struck her with both clarity and nausea. Someone inside the company, someone with access to internal files and letterheads, was working against her. The question was who. For days, she said nothing. Instead, she began to quietly monitor staff behavior. The accountant, old Hamid, had grown nervous lately. The cashier avoided eye contact. Even the store manager, who once greeted her warmly, seemed uneasy when she passed. Yet none of them seemed capable of orchestrating such calculated deceit. Then she remembered, Rayan. Her stepbrother had been unusually attentive to the business lately, dropping by under the guise of helping. He had spent hours reviewing contracts, chatting with the accountant, and promising new investors. At the time, she dismissed it as one of his restless attempts to look useful. But now, with forged documents surfacing, the coincidences became too sharp to ignore. She visited the municipal office that week, dressed in her usual calm authority. The clerk at the land records desk greeted her politely and fetched the relevant files. When the folder landed before her, Alina felt her heart sink. There, neatly clipped to the front, was a renewal request. Signed, Alina Rahman, General Manager. Stamped and filed. Dated 3 weeks prior. The clerk confirmed that a man had submitted it in person, identifying himself as her company's authorized representative. He provided a national ID copy, but the photocopy was faint, only the first name was readable. Rayan. Her suspicions turned to certainty. Her stepbrother was trying to transfer the lease under his name before she could act. It wasn't just theft. It was a hostile takeover, from within the family. That night, Alina stayed in the office long after closing. The city outside dimmed into silence as she sorted through every file, every authorization letter, every payment log. The deeper she looked, the clearer it became. Rayan had been working on this scheme for months. He had built an illusion of her involvement to ensure no one questioned the legitimacy of his actions. He'd even gone as far as planting rumors among staff, claiming that the company would soon rebrand, and that he was managing negotiations with the city to streamline ownership. Some employees believed him. Others stayed quiet out of fear. But Alina was not easily broken. Once the shock faded, her instincts shifted from disbelief to strategy. She knew that confronting Rayan immediately would be useless. He'd deny everything and twist the narrative. She needed evidence strong enough to not only expose him but also ensure he couldn't recover from it. She began her counter-move carefully. Each night, she scanned documents, labeled folders, and documented inconsistencies. She met discreetly with an old lawyer who had once handled their supplier disputes, explaining that she suspected internal forgery. The lawyer advised her to collect proof quietly and avoid triggering legal counters that could delay the lease auction. The lease auction, that was the key. If the renewal moved to open bidding, she could legally outmaneuver him. But to win, she'd need financial leverage, staff loyalty, and public trust, 3 things Rayan was actively undermining. Weeks passed, and the tension inside the shop grew heavy. Rumors circulated that ownership was about to change hands. Rayan walked around the premises with a new confidence, greeting employees with mock kindness. He spoke to suppliers in whispers and avoided his sister entirely. Then, one evening, Alina overheard him in the parking area. He was on the phone, speaking low but clear enough for a few words to cut through the air. Once the auction is announced, we'll secure the land under my company name. She won't even see it coming. The words burned in her mind. That night, she made her decision. She would not only protect the family business, she would make Rayan answer for every deceitful act he had committed. The next morning, she gathered the senior staff before opening hours. Calm, composed, she announced that an internal audit would begin immediately. The atmosphere tensed, but her authority was unshakable. Every record, every transaction, every authorization will be reviewed. Anyone who has collaborated in unauthorized dealings should step forward now. Silence will only make things worse later. Her tone was icy, deliberate, and precise. She wasn't accusing, she was declaring war. Rayan arrived minutes later, smiling with false innocence, pretending confusion at her sudden strictness. But Alina didn't even look his way. She knew the battle had officially begun. As the day ended, she looked across the street at the old municipal office building. The sun was setting behind it, the same place where Rayan had forged her name to steal their legacy. She whispered to herself, not as a prayer, but as a promise that she would reclaim what was hers, not through deceit, but through strength and proof. The auction date hadn't been announced yet, but it was coming, and when it did, she would be ready. The air inside Rahman Sons grew heavier in the days that followed Alina's announcement. What had once been a lively trading floor now carried the stillness of tension and suspicion. Employees spoke in hushed tones. Clerks avoided eye contact. The ringing of the old wall clock seemed louder than usual. The audit had begun not as a routine check, but as a quiet cleansing. Alina oversaw everything with surgical precision. Her office became a fortress of files, receipts, contracts, and handwritten notes pinned across corkboards. The walls that once displayed certificates and family photos now bore maps of connections, arrows drawn in red ink linking names, transactions, and suspicious dates. It was no longer just a review, it was an investigation. Her first finding came from the procurement department. A sequence of supplier payments had been rerouted through a shell company, Mizan Logistics, a business that had recently appeared on their vendor list. Its address led to an empty storefront, and its bank account had been opened under a proxy name. The accountant, Hamid, had processed the payments, claiming he was following direct orders from upper management. When Alina confronted the paper trail, his hands trembled. He admitted that Rayan had given him verbal instructions, insisting that the funds were part of a confidential expansion. The revelation broke the first link in Rayan's chain. Alina thanked the accountant quietly but didn't fire him. She knew fear, not greed, had guided his compliance. Firing him would only drive the others deeper into silence. Instead, she promised immunity to anyone who cooperated, a move that slowly began turning the tide of loyalty within the company. By the end of the week, the audit revealed a darker pattern. Over 2 months, several transactions disguised as property maintenance expenses had been diverted to pay for private consultants, experts in valuation, legal drafting, and land assessment. All of them had been hired through Rayan's contacts. It was clear he was preparing to take full ownership of the business land once the lease auction opened. While Alina worked late into the night, Rayan carried himself with growing arrogance. He arrived each morning in expensive suits, taking calls loudly in front of the staff, hinting at future plans and partnerships. He believed he had already won, that his sister's audit was nothing more than a desperate act of control. But what Rayan didn't know was that Alina had already started coordinating with external auditors and a government-certified document examiner. Each forged signature, each authorization letter, each payment misdirection was being verified for illegal presentation. Quietly, her lawyer had begun drafting a case file, a defense that would not only expose Rainey's fraud but also make him ineligible to participate in the land auction. Still, Alina knew she needed more than paperwork to win. She needed people, the staff, the suppliers, the community, to see her as the rightful heir to the family's legacy. Without that, even legal victory would taste hollow, so she began rebuilding trust. She visited the warehouse daily, inspecting inventory with workers, helping load trucks, sharing tea breaks with old employees who remembered her father's kindness. She asked questions about their families, their challenges, their loyalties. Slowly, the staff that had grown distant began to look at her not with fear, but with respect again. Word spread through the market that Alina was tightening control, cleaning corruption, and restoring order. Small shop owners nearby began to support her, offering assistance and vouching for her reputation. Her leadership began to rebuild the very foundation Rayan had tried to erode. Meanwhile, Rayan grew restless. His inside network was collapsing. The accountant who once obeyed him now avoided his calls. The store manager who had been promised a promotion began siding with Alina. Even the municipal clerk he'd bribed grew cautious after hearing whispers of an internal inquiry. The more Rayan felt cornered, the more reckless he became. He started showing up at the office late drunk, muttering about betrayals and ungrateful workers. One evening, after the staff had left, he stormed into the office, rummaging through files, searching for something, perhaps the forged letters, perhaps proof that could protect him. Alina, who had anticipated this, had already moved every critical document to a locked cabinet at her lawyer's office. The next morning, when she found the drawers open and papers scattered, she understood how desperate he was becoming. But she didn't confront him. Not yet. His arrogance was his own undoing, and she needed him to believe he still held power until the moment she took it all back. As the audit neared completion, a new notice arrived from the municipal authorities. The public auction for market leases was scheduled in 3 weeks. The very land beneath Rahman Sons was listed, plot number 82B, the heart of their legacy. The announcement spread like wildfire across the district. Other shop owners prepared their bids, but none had as much at stake as the Rahman family. To everyone else, it was business. To Alina and Rayan, it was war. Rayan saw the auction as his final chance. He had already secured a private investor to back his bid, a man with questionable ethics but deep pockets. Alina, on the other hand, began strategizing differently. She didn't want outside help that would compromise the shop's independence. Instead, she sought alliances within the market community, old partners, suppliers and clients who owed her favors from years of honest dealing. In the following days, she met with them quietly, explaining her intent to keep the business under family control and preserve its workers' jobs. Some offered partial funding, others pledged resources. Piece by piece, she built a support network powerful enough to stand against Rayan's external financing. The city buzzed with rumors. The Step siblings are bidding against each other, people whispered. The family's tearing itself apart for the land. But Alina didn't care about gossip. She cared about truth. By the second week, her audit report was complete. It listed every false transaction, every forgery, and every fraudulent act committed in Rayan's shadow. The final pages included certified verifications from legal experts, proving beyond doubt that her stepbrother had attempted corporate fraud. She didn't submit the report yet. Timing was everything. Instead, she waited. She let Rayan believe he still had the upper hand, that the auction would end with his victory. The more confident he grew, the harder his fall would be. On the eve of the auction, Alina stood alone inside the dimly lit shop. The air smelled of old wood and varnish, of decades of history. Her father's framed photograph hung above the counter, smiling faintly, a reminder of everything that had once been right. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent vow to protect what he built, not through inheritance, but through justice. Outside, across the street, Rayan's car was parked. Through the windshield, his silhouette glowed against the light of his phone screen. He was texting, probably finalizing deals, perhaps boasting to his partners that he'd finally outplayed his stepsister. But what he didn't know, not yet, was that the game he thought he controlled had already turned. The morning of the auction dawned with a strange, heavy stillness, the kind that comes before storms. Al-Mazra's municipal hall, usually quiet except for clerks and filing cabinets, was alive with noise. Dozens of shop owners, landholders, and business representatives had gathered, their chatter echoing through marble corridors. The air buzzed with anticipation and ambition. For most, this was a day of opportunity. For Alina and Rayan, it was the day everything would be decided. Outside, television vans and local reporters had begun setting up, covering what the press was already calling the market lease day. For decades, the old market land had been leased under ancestral agreements. This year, as auction marked the first open bid process, a modernization initiative that had drawn every merchant's attention. Rayan arrived first. Dressed sharply, his designer suit gleaming, he exuded confidence. His investor, a shadowy businessman named Feud, followed him closely, short, broad-shouldered, and reeking of arrogance. They entered the hall like victors, as though the outcome were already written. Moments later, Alina arrived in contrast, calm, dressed simply in a pastel suit, holding a single folder under her arm. There were no investors beside her, no entourage. Only a quiet confidence that unsettled those who watched her. Inside, the auction room was arranged like a courtroom, rows of seats facing a raised platform where the municipal officer presided. Files stacked before him, he announced that each property would be called in order, bids submitted, and winners finalized on the spot. The atmosphere was electric. As the first few auctions proceeded, warehouses, small stalls, side plots, Alina sat silently, her eyes occasionally drifting toward Rayan. He avoided her gaze, but his smirk betrayed his certainty. His investor had deep pockets. There was no way she could outbid him. Then the officer called out the next property, Plot A2B, current tenant, Rahman Sons General Traders. The name drew murmurs from the crowd. Everyone in the district knew of the tension between the step-siblings. Some leaned forward, eager to witness the confrontation that had fueled weeks of gossip. The bidding began. The officer announced the base value, and instantly, Rayan raised his hand. His investor nodded approvingly. Alina waited. Another bidder, a small grocer from the adjacent lane, raised the amount slightly, then withdrew. The room watched as the bids climbed. Rayan, confident, lifting the number each time without hesitation. Then, after several rounds, Alina finally spoke, her voice clear, steady, cutting through the murmurs. She placed her bid. It was modest but deliberate. Rayan glanced her way, amused. "She's bluffing," his investor whispered. But when the officer called for the next round, Alina raised again, calmly, strategically. Each time Rayan countered, she matched, inch for inch, never rushing, never hesitating. The rhythm became a duel of patience and pride. Minutes turned into an hour. The hall had gone silent except for the officer's voice. Sweat began to form on Rayan's temple. His investor shifted uneasily. The bids were climbing higher than they had planned. Rayan leaned toward Feud, muttering for approval before each increase. Alina, meanwhile, continued unflinching. For every number they threw, she responded with precision, like someone who had calculated exactly how far her opponent could go. Finally, the figure reached a point where the investor hesitated. Feud whispered sharply, "This isn't worth it anymore. We can find other plots." But Rayan's pride refused to listen. Losing to Alina in public was unthinkable. He lifted his hand once more, his jaw tight. The officer acknowledged the bid, paused, then turned to Alina. She looked up, eyes unwavering, and calmly named a figure just slightly higher, not dramatically, but enough to surpass. The officer repeated it aloud. The silence was deafening. Rayan's hands clenched. Feud shook his head, unwilling to go further. After a long pause, the officer struck the gavel. Plot 8 to be awarded to Rahman and Sons General Traders, under General Manager Ms. Alina Rahman. Applause broke out among the audience, hesitant at first, then swelling as people realized what had just happened. Against all expectations, Alina had outbid her stepbrother and secured the family's foundation. Rayan sat frozen, disbelief etched across his face. His pride, his scheme, his months of plotting, undone before the entire business community. But Alina wasn't finished. As the murmurs filled the hall, she stood gracefully, handing her folder to the municipal officer. "Sir," she said firmly, "I request that this document be entered into record alongside the lease transfer, for full transparency." The officer nodded and opened the folder. Inside were certified audit reports, bank statements, and legal verifications. Proof of forgery, embezzlement, and misuse of company authority. The officer's brows furrowed as he read. Around the room, the whispers turned into shocked silence. Rayan paled. His investor leaned back, realization dawning that he had backed a fraud. The officer cleared his throat, his tone heavy. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Rayan. The documents will be forwarded to the Commercial Investigation Unit. Until then, your right to represent any corporate entity in public tender is hereby suspended." The words hit like a hammer. Rayan tried to speak, but no sound came. Security personnel quietly approached as the crowd began murmuring again. Half curious, half pitying. Alina didn't gloat. She didn't even look at him as she gathered her papers. She simply bowed slightly to the officer and walked out of the hall. The cameras outside caught her calm expression, the quiet poise of someone who had fought a silent war and won it with dignity. By afternoon, the news spread through the city. Stepbrother exposed in market lease scam, sister wins family legacy at auction. The headlines flooded social media. In every market corner, people praised her composure, her intelligence, and the justice of her victory. Back at the shop, the employees had already heard. When she returned, they greeted her with cautious smiles that quickly turned to admiration. For the first time in months, the air felt light again. That evening, she stood before the counter, the same spot her father once stood, and watched as the lights glowed across the street. The shop had survived. Her family's name had survived, but deep inside she knew her work wasn't over. The business was safe, yes, but Rayan's actions had left wounds, broken trust, shaken loyalty, and a shadow of scandal. Restoring the company's spirit would take more than legal victory. It would require rebuilding from within. And though Rayan had fallen, his story within the family was not yet over. His punishment would not be exile, but something far more humbling, a lesson in accountability and humility. As she locked up that night, the shop stood quiet beneath the moonlight, its signboard glowing faintly. The war for control was over. The journey toward rebuilding had just begun. The next chapter would reveal how Alina rebuilt the company after the scandal, earned back public trust, and faced the difficult decision of bringing Rayan back, not as a partner, but as a subordinate in the value of integrity. In the days following the auction, Rahman and Sons became the talk of Al-Mazra. Newspapers ran headlines about integrity triumphing over deceit. Radio commentators praised Alina's composure during the public showdown. For the first time in years, the old shop stood not as a relic of family tension, but as a symbol of resilience. Yet, behind the public admiration lay an enormous task: reconstruction. The victory had secured the land, but it had not healed the fractures within. Many employees were still cautious, unsure whether their jobs were safe or whether another wave of instability might follow. Suppliers demanded reassurance that payments would remain steady. Even loyal clients needed to be convinced that the company's reputation would not be tarnished by scandal. Alina understood that legal triumph meant nothing if trust did not return. So she began again, slowly, deliberately, from the ground up. The first step was transparency. She called every department head into a private meeting and laid bare the truth. The forgery, the fraud, the manipulation. Nothing was hidden. She spoke not to shame them, but to remind them that honesty was the only foundation strong enough to rebuild upon. She instituted new checks. Digital accounting, dual authorization for major expenditures, and external auditing every quarter. What had once been an informal, family-run business now transformed into a professional operation. The transition was not easy. Many senior staff struggled with new procedures, grumbling about passwords and computerized ledgers. But Alina's calm persistence softened resistance. She spent long evenings teaching them herself, explaining that the company's survival depended on adaptation. Gradually, change began to show. The shelves looked fuller. The deliveries ran smoother. Even the building itself seemed brighter after a thorough renovation. The front signboard was repainted not with her name, but with her father's, preserved exactly as it had been decades ago. It was her way of reminding everyone that the shop's spirit belonged not to one person, but to the legacy of work that had built it. Yet, amid the quiet success, an emptiness lingered. Rayan had vanished from public view after the auction. Rumors drifted through the market. Some said he had left the city, others that he was hiding in shame. Alina avoided speculation. She neither spoke against him nor sought revenge. In private, she felt a complex ache, a mixture of sorrow and disbelief that her own brother by family bond had chosen betrayal over kinship. Months passed, and the business stabilized. Profits returned. Suppliers extended credit willingly. New contracts flowed in. The staff who had once been nervous now spoke with pride again. But one afternoon, while Alina was reviewing export orders, a soft knock broke her focus. It was the gatekeeper. He looked hesitant as he said, "Madam, there's a man outside asking to see you. Says his name is Rayan." For a long moment she didn't speak. Then, quietly she nodded. "Send him in." When Rayan entered, he looked nothing like the arrogant man who had strutted through the auction hall. His clothes were plain, his expression hollow. The sharp confidence in his eyes had been replaced by a subdued shame. He greeted her softly, almost whispering. Alina remained seated, her face unreadable. He spoke haltingly, explaining how he had been blacklisted from future tenders, how his investor had abandoned him, and how debts had mounted until he was left with nothing. The scandal had stripped him of reputation, connections, and pride. Now he sought forgiveness not as an excuse, but as a plea for another chance to rebuild his life. Alina listened in silence. Every word he spoke reminded her of the sleepless nights, the forged letters, the humiliation. Yet, she also remembered her father's teachings, the belief that justice without mercy turned into bitterness. When he finished speaking, she remained still for a long time before finally saying that the company had no position open for management. Rayan lowered his head, murmuring that he would accept any work, no matter how small. The next morning, the staff watched in stunned silence as Alina walked through the trading floor accompanied by her stepbrother. She introduced him not as an executive, not even as a partner, but as a junior clerk responsible for data entry and document filing. No one dared question her decision, but whispers filled the corners of the building. Some thought it cruel, others thought it wise. Alina ignored them all. Rayan began his new role quietly. Gone were the tailor's suits and expensive watches. He sat among the lowest-ranked employees, sorting invoices, recording shipments, and answering calls. The same people he once ordered around now watched him carry stacks of paperwork up the stairs. At first there was resentment toward him, but Alina's calm example softened their hostility. She treated him like any other worker, firmly, fairly, without emotion. Over time, something unexpected began to happen. Humiliation turned into humility. Rayan stopped avoiding eye contact. He started helping others without being asked. He learned how much effort went into the daily grind he had once taken for granted. Each day, He left exhausted, but with a quiet sense of redemption forming in his chest. Months turned into a year. The shop's new systems thrived, sales doubled, and the company once again became one of Al-Mazra's most respected suppliers. The staff grew loyal to Alina not just because of her intelligence, but because of her fairness. She had turned a scandal into a model of accountability. One evening, long after closing, she passed the records desk where Rayan still worked. He was organizing old invoices, carefully labeling folders. He didn't notice her at first. She watched silently for a moment, seeing in him not the rival who had betrayed her, but a man finally beginning to understand the meaning of responsibility. She walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder light, wordless, neither forgiving nor condemning, just acknowledging the effort he was finally making. He looked up, startled, and their eyes met for the first time in months. No words were exchanged, but in that brief silence, the weight of the past seemed to shift ever so slightly. From that night forward, the shop moved into a new era not of rivalry or fear, but of balance. Rayan remained in his humble position, earning trust one small task at a time. Alina continued to lead with quiet strength, proving that leadership born of integrity endures longer than ambition built on deceit. And as the seasons changed and the market around them evolved, Rahman Sons stood taller than ever, its foundation not only secured by law and ownership, but by the lessons carved into its history. The next chapter would reveal the transformation that followed, how Alina expanded the business beyond Al-Mazra, how Rayan's humility reshaped his character, and how the legacy they both inherited finally found peace after years of conflict. By the time a full year had passed since the auction, Rahman Sons had not only recovered its stability, it had begun to grow beyond the narrow lanes of Al-Mazra's market. What had once been a humble supply store now bore the polished rhythm of a regional trading company. Trucks carried its goods to towns across the province, and its logo appeared on billboards near highways. For the first time in its history, the shop's influence extended beyond its own district. The expansion did not happen overnight. It began with a single partnership and export opportunity offered by a construction supplier who admired Alina's discipline. She had negotiated cautiously, demanding terms that favored long-term reliability over quick profit. The first shipment went smoothly. The second, better. By the third, the company had earned a reputation for precision and honesty. Soon new contracts followed. The name Rahman Sons became synonymous with trust. Alina managed it all with quiet endurance. Her leadership style had evolved less defensive, more visionary. Where she once guarded the shop against betrayal, she now guided it toward innovation. A new warehouse rose on the outskirts of the city, equipped with modern inventory systems. Younger employees were trained in logistics and accounting, while older ones were moved into advisory roles, their experience honored rather than replaced. The staff who had once feared instability now felt pride swelling in their work. And through all this, Rayan remained there at the same desk, filing, recording, assisting wherever needed. No one mocked him anymore. His consistency had earned quiet respect. He arrived early, stayed late, and never complained. The man who had once chased shortcuts now found meaning in simple discipline. One afternoon, during a quarterly review, Alina noticed something. Among the reports, a new suggestion had appeared, a small proposal for improving supply chain efficiency, written in neat handwriting. At the bottom of the page was Rayan's signature. She read it carefully. It was practical, thoughtful, and based on data he had quietly gathered during his clerical duties. It wasn't brilliance, but it was honest work, genuine, considered, and sincere. Instead of returning it to him with critique, she approved the plan. The idea saved the company thousands in monthly transportation costs. Word spread, and for the first time the staff began to see Rayan not as the fallen heir, but as a man earning his redemption step by step. The change was not only visible in his work, but in his demeanor. He no longer avoided Alina's presence. When she walked into the office, he stood respectfully and greeted her with quiet gratitude. There was no trace of rivalry in his tone, only humility. It seemed that the burden of disgrace had finally given way to the strength of understanding. Months later, during a leadership meeting, Alina made a decision that surprised everyone. She announced the creation of a new department, Regional Distribution Coordination, and appointed Rayan as its supervisor. The position was modest but significant, a chance for him to lead again under her oversight. The room fell silent. Sun looked uneasy, remembering the past, but Alina's voice left no room for debate. Every person, she said, deserves one opportunity to rebuild themselves through action, not words. Rayan accepted the post with a bowed head, fully aware of the weight it carried. His work intensified organizing shipments, negotiating delivery timelines, resolving small crises on the road. He made mistakes, but he corrected them himself. Slowly the scars of the old feud began to fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of purpose. Outside the company, Alina's leadership began attracting attention from the business community. She was invited to conferences, recognized for ethical reform in family enterprises, and asked to speak on transparency in trade. Journalists admired the story how a stepsister had saved a legacy without bitterness. But she rarely accepted interviews. Public praise meant little to her. What mattered was the quiet hum of progress inside the walls her father had built. Rayan, too, began to rebuild beyond the office. He paid off his debts, reconnected with old friends, and even began mentoring junior staff, warning them about the dangers of arrogance and shortcuts. His humility, once born of shame, matured into wisdom. And though he never spoke openly about the past, everyone could see that he carried its lessons like a silent oath. Years passed like this. The company grew into a network of branches across the province, employing hundreds. Alina became the figure every trader respected, firm yet just, modern yet moral. The old market where the business began turned into a distribution hub, and the signboard that read Rahman Sons still hung proudly, unaltered. One evening, after a particularly long day of reviewing expansion contracts, Alina stood at the window of her office overlooking the warehouse district. The sun was setting over the horizon, washing the city in amber light. Behind her, Rayan entered quietly, carrying a report. He placed it on her desk, then hesitated. When she turned, their eyes met as rivals, not even as superior and subordinate, but as two people bound by history, failure, and redemption. For the first time, she saw not the boy who had tried to steal her future, but the man who had helped her secure it. She nodded, a faint smile crossing her face. "Good work," she said softly. It was a simple phrase, but in that moment, it carried the weight of forgiveness. From that day forward, a subtle peace settled between them. They would never be close in the way siblings sometimes are, too much had happened for that, but there was mutual respect. An unspoken acknowledgement that the past had shaped them both into who they had become. The company, now thriving, bore the marks of their combined journeys, her discipline, his humility, their shared redemption. And though the world outside saw only profit and expansion, those within the walls of Rahman and Sons knew the truth, that the real victory lay not in the land they owned or the business they built, but in the moral ground reclaimed between two people who had once been enemies under the same roof. The next chapter will follow the company's rise onto the international stage, exploring how Alina faces new corporate challenges while Rayan finally earns his full redemption through a critical decision that tests everything he has learned. 3 years after the auction, Rahman and Sons General Traders no longer belonged to just one marketplace or even one country. It had evolved into a regional enterprise, a name carried across borders on shipments of construction materials, agricultural equipment, and industrial supplies. Trucks bearing the company's logo crossed checkpoints every day, and contracts now came from cities Alina had once only read about in trade journals. For Alina, success brought new challenges. International expansion meant navigating tariffs, cultural expectations, and competitive politics. Her calm discipline was now tested in conference rooms instead of crowded bazaars. She dealt with foreign investors, government permits, and currency fluctuations. The company had grown beyond what her father ever imagined, yet she never forgot its humble foundation. Rayan, too, had changed. The humility forged from his downfall had matured into something steady, responsibility. His division, regional distribution coordination, had become the backbone of the company's logistics. Under his careful management, delivery times shortened, customer satisfaction improved, and losses from transport damage nearly disappeared. He had become indispensable. But unlike before, he carried no arrogance, only quiet pride in the trust he'd regained. One autumn morning, Alina sat in her new office overlooking the expanding port district. A courier delivered an envelope marked with the logo of a foreign trade group, a consortium from the Gulf region offering a lucrative export partnership. It was the biggest proposal the company had ever received. If accepted, it would double their revenue within a year. But one clause caught her eye. The partnership required an overseas representative to live abroad for a minimum of 6 months to oversee operations. Alina knew she couldn't leave. The company's foundation, though stable, still needed her direction. She would need someone she trusted completely, someone who could carry her integrity into a foreign market. She thought long and hard before making her decision. That evening, after reviewing the details, she called Rayan into her office. He entered with a file in hand, expecting another review. But when she handed him the contract, his expression changed. He read the first few pages and froze. The position of International Operations Head was printed clearly beside his name. He looked up slowly, disbelief flickering in his eyes. Alina said nothing at first. She only watched him, measuring not his ambition, but his composure. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice steady but uncertain. "You're trusting me with this?" Her answer was calm. "I'm trusting who you've become." For a moment, neither spoke. Then, quietly he nodded. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Rayan studied export laws, met translators, reviewed trade regulations, and coordinated logistics across borders. It was grueling, but he tackled every detail with precision. For the first time, he was not chasing glory, he was earning responsibility through diligence. When he finally departed, the staff gathered to see him off. It was not a grand farewell, but a warm one. Some shook his hand, others clapped his shoulder. Alina watched from the doorway, her expression composed, though beneath it lay quiet pride. The new foreign office opened in the coastal city of Sharjah. Rayan arrived to find a warehouse half-built, paperwork incomplete, and suppliers hesitant to deal with a small company from Pakistan. He spent his first weeks on the ground, not in meetings, but in the heat of construction sites, speaking with workers, overseeing shipments, solving problems firsthand. Slowly, his persistence began to change minds. One supplier extended a line of credit, another offered warehouse space. He earned respect the same way his sister had, through endurance, but success, as always, invited temptation. One night, a powerful local investor approached him with an offer, a shortcut. The man promised faster licensing, cheaper shipping, and exclusive contracts, all in exchange for shared profits under the table. The old Rayan might have agreed instantly. The new one hesitated. He spent the night pacing his small apartment, torn between greed and conscience. Signing the deal would guarantee success, but it would betray the values that had rebuilt his life. At dawn, he made his choice. He refused the offer. The investor's smile vanished, replaced by veiled threats. Yet Rayan stood firm. "I built my second chance on honesty," he said simply. "I won't lose it chasing the first." The weeks that followed were difficult. The investor spread rumors, suppliers grew cautious again, and business slowed. Rayan faced isolation and frustration. But when the next audit came, his records were spotless, every transaction transparent, every receipt clean. Months later, Alina visited Sharjah to inspect operations. She found a thriving office, respected among local traders for its fairness and discipline. When she asked about challenges, the staff spoke of Rayan's integrity, how he refused shortcuts, how he protected the company's name, even when profits suffered. That evening, she met him at the warehouse as workers locked up. He looked older now, his once youthful arrogance replaced by calm certainty. As they walked through the echoing aisles, she realized that the company's expansion wasn't just physical, it was moral. The same man who had once forged documents now embodied the honesty their father had once dreamed of. Before leaving, she turned to him and said softly, "You've earned back what was lost." He didn't reply. He only nodded, eyes lowered, his silence speaking louder than gratitude. When Alina returned to Al-Mazra, she felt a rare peace. The company she had fought to protect was now self-sustaining, guided by two hands that had once been at war, but were now united by hard-won understanding. Under their shared leadership, Rahman and Sons entered a golden age, contracts across the Gulf, partnerships in Africa, recognition in trade expos. The name once tainted by family scandal now stood for reliability and honor. And in every shipment sent abroad, every contract signed, every warehouse opened, there remained an invisible thread, the redemption of a family torn by ambition and healed by integrity. The years that followed marked the true golden age of Rahman and Sons General Traders. What began decades ago as a single shop in the narrow lanes of Al-Mazra had transformed into a multinational enterprise, one that commanded respect across borders. Its name appeared in business magazines, trade reports, and conference halls, often cited as a model of ethical family entrepreneurship. Alina, now in her early 40s, had become something of a legend in the regional business community. She was known not for her wealth, but for her incorruptible leadership, calm, composed, and precise. She carried herself with quiet grace, avoiding the vanity of public recognition. Her satisfaction came from seeing her father's vision live on in modern form. At the center of this flourishing empire was a philosophy she repeated to every new employee: "We don't sell goods, we build trust." That principle had taken root so deeply that even competitors respected the company's fairness. It was no longer just a business. It was a standard. Rayan, too, had found his rightful place within this new era. Years of hard work abroad had tempered him into a man of substance and calm strength. He no longer sought validation in titles or status. The mistakes of his youth had carved humility into his very nature. When he returned from Sharjah to Al-Mazra, he didn't demand an executive office. He took a modest one beside the logistics wing, preferring proximity to the workers who kept the company alive. The staff admired him. To them, he was living proof that a person could fall from grace and still climb back not through privilege, but through effort. He mentored young clerks, trained supervisors, and spoke often about the importance of patience. He had learned, through pain and redemption, that growth without character was ruin waiting to happen. Under their dual leadership, Rahman and Sons diversified into multiple sectors: agricultural imports, industrial materials, and supply chain consulting. New branches opened across the Gulf, South Asia, and East Africa. Alina handled governance and policy. Rayan oversaw distribution and operations. Their roles complemented one another with quiet precision. And yet, even in prosperity, Alina understood that success carried its own trials. With growth came investors who wanted influence, politicians who wanted favors, and family members who suddenly remembered their lineage. Everyone wanted a share of what she and Rayan had rebuilt. But she had learned to protect the company with foresight. She established a formal board, recruited external advisors, and ensured that the business could survive beyond the family. The transformation was not merely financial, it was generational. Still, at the heart of every achievement, there remained a quiet awareness. Time was passing. Their father's photograph still hung behind her desk, a silent guardian over the empire. The once young siblings who had fought over a shop now stood as custodians of an institution. It was during this period that Alina began to think of succession not out of fatigue, but from wisdom. She had seen too many legacies crumble when leadership refused to evolve. The company needed new energy. younger vision, unburdened by the history that had shaped her and Rayan, she began selecting and grooming a new generation of managers, bright, ethical individuals who understood that integrity was non-negotiable. She made sure that the culture of honesty outlived her presence. Rayan joined her in this mission, teaching logistics and negotiation to recruits, sharing lessons learned from both failure and redemption. Together they became mentors more than executives, builders of a philosophy, not just an enterprise. But fate, ever unpredictable, soon reminded them that prosperity never remains without testing. One winter evening, while reviewing a shipping contract, Rayan noticed irregularities in the accounts of a new overseas branch. The numbers were too perfect, too smooth to be real. He investigated quietly and discovered that a regional manager had begun diverting funds through shell contracts, not unlike what Rayan himself had done years ago. For a long time, he stared at the evidence in silence. It felt like a haunting echo of his own past. But this time, he was on the other side of the truth. The next morning, he called the manager into his office. Without anger, without spectacle, he explained what he had found. The man broke down, pleading for mercy, blaming desperation. Rayan listened patiently, but his voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of experience. "I once made the same mistake," he said. "And I destroyed everything that trusted me. You will not do the same here." He dismissed the manager, not with cruelty, but with discipline. The case was documented, reported transparently, and resolved according to company policy. For the first time, Rayan became what Alina had once been for him, the hand of accountability, the mirror of conscience. When Alina heard of the incident, she said nothing at first. She only placed a note on his desk that evening, written in her steady handwriting. "The cycle is complete. You have become the very strength that once saved you." It was a moment of quiet revelation for both of them. The company no longer needed saving, it had become self-sustaining. The values once defended through conflict now lived in the daily actions of everyone who worked there. The world outside saw growth and profit, but those inside knew the deeper story that Rahman and Sons had been built not just on land and labor, but on forgiveness and moral rebirth. As the years deepened into maturity, Alina and Rayan became symbols of balance. She remained the strategist, he the executor. She represented vision, he represented resilience. Together they proved that legacy was not inherited, it was earned, often rebuilt from ashes. By the end of the decade, the company was entering a new chapter of its own, led by a generation that had grown up watching the two of them transform conflict into cooperation. The seeds of the future had been planted. And though both siblings knew their roles would someday fade into history, neither feared it. Because unlike before, their legacy no longer depended on control, it rested on the moral foundation they had fought, lost, and reclaimed together. That night, as the lights dimmed across the headquarters and the hum of machinery faded, Alina walked through the silent corridors. She paused by the old signboard from the first shop, now preserved behind glass. Its faded letters read the same as always, Rahman and Sons. For a long time she stood there, remembering everything, the betrayals, the victories, the endless nights of rebuilding. Then she smiled faintly, knowing that the name now stood for something greater than either of them. The winter sun hung low over Al-Mazra, its pale light spilling across the newly built headquarters of Rahman and Sons International. The building stood as a quiet testament to endurance, steel and glass rising from the same ground where, decades ago, a wooden signboard had hung above a dusty storefront. Inside its walls, the rhythm of commerce pulsed with order and confidence. The company had become a living organism, self-sustaining, adaptable, and deeply rooted in the values that had once saved it. For Alina, time had begun to slow. She still arrived before sunrise, her rituals unchanged. Black tea at her desk, a review of ledgers, a glance at her father's photograph. But her reflection in the office window now carried silver strands of age, softened by wisdom. She no longer fought to prove herself. She simply ensured that those who followed would never need to. Rayan, now in his late 30s, had matured into a figure of quiet influence. He oversaw logistics across 3 continents and was known among partners as the man whose word needed no contract. Where once his pride had nearly destroyed him, now his integrity anchored the company's operations. Staff sought his advice as often as they did Alina's. Together, they had become symbols of resilience, the steady heart and the redeemed soul of a family reborn through struggle. But change, inevitable as time itself, began to whisper through the corridors. A new generation of leaders had emerged within the company, young executives, trained under Alina's guidance, filled with energy and vision. They spoke of digital platforms, automated warehouses, green trade policies, concepts that belonged to the future. Alina watched them with pride, knowing her role was shifting from leader to mentor. Still, one matter weighed on her mind: succession. The company needed a formal plan for continuity, something that would outlast sentiment and bloodlines alike. She had seen too many family businesses crumble when founders clung too long. Legacy, she believed, was not about holding power, it was about passing it wisely. So, one evening she called a board meeting. Around the table sat old faces and new veteran managers, auditors, and young department heads. Rayan sat opposite her, calm and attentive. The meeting room was silent as she spoke. "I will be stepping back from day-to-day operations," she announced. "It is time for the company to evolve under new leadership. Rayan will assume the role of managing director, effective immediately. I will remain as chairperson, but only in an advisory capacity." The room held its breath. The announcement was both expected and astonishing. To entrust the company's reins to the very man who had once tried to seize it, this was more than forgiveness. It was faith, refined by years of redemption. Rayan's eyes lowered, humility and disbelief crossing his face. When he finally looked up, the expression was not triumph, but quiet gratitude. After the meeting, Alina stayed behind, gazing out of the glass wall at the city lights. She felt no sadness, only completion. For years, she had carried the weight of the family name on her shoulders. Now, she could finally set it down, knowing it rested in hands that had learned its worth the hard way. In the months that followed, the transition unfolded smoothly. Under Rayan's direction, the company modernized, further introducing automation, sustainability programs, and digital transparency systems. The reforms mirrored Alina's philosophy, but they bore his signature efficiency. He often quoted her during meetings, reminding staff that integrity is a profit that never depreciates. The business flourished, but life's seasons continued their rhythm. Alina began to withdraw from the corporate world, spending more time at her countryside home where the air smelled of jasmine and quiet. Yet she never severed her connection. Every month, she visited the old headquarters, walking through the same corridors she once fought to save. The employees still stood respectfully when she passed, calling her Madam Founder. It was during one such visit late one evening that Rayan found her in the lobby, standing before the framed relic of the original shop sign. The building was nearly empty, the lights dimmed for closing. He approached quietly, standing beside her without speaking. For a while they simply looked at the sign, the faded lettering, the cracks in the wood. It held the ghosts of everything they had endured: deceit, rivalry, forgiveness, rebirth. Finally Alina spoke, her voice calm and steady. "Do you remember," she said, "how this place almost slipped away from us?" Rayan nodded slowly. "Every day." She turned to him then, her expression soft but resolute. "Promise me something, Rayan. Never let this company lose its soul. Profit fades, buildings age, names change, but honesty and humility, once lost, can never be rebuilt." He met her gaze and replied with quiet certainty, "I promise." That was the last time they spoke of business. A year later, Alina passed away peacefully at her home, surrounded by the serenity she had spent a lifetime earning. Her funeral drew people from across nations, employees, partners, and even rivals. Newspapers across the region ran tributes titled "The Woman Who Built Trust." Rayan stood beside her resting place, the winter wind carrying the faint scent of incense. he did not cry. His grief was not loud, it was steady, like the rhythm of a heart remembering its compass. In the days that followed, he returned to work with renewed purpose. He renamed the company's scholarship program in her honor, funding education for young women in business management. He also established the Alina Foundation, focused on promoting ethical entrepreneurship across developing markets. Under his guidance, Rahman Sons continued to grow, but he kept one ritual unchanged. Every morning, before opening his email or signing a document, he stood before the framed photograph of his sister and whispered the same words she once said, "We don't sell goods, we build trust." Years later, when he too grew old, he often visited the original site of their first shop, now preserved as a small heritage museum. Inside, visitors could see the wooden counter, the handwritten ledgers, and the old cash register. But at the center stood a bronze plaque bearing a single inscription: "Founded on honesty, rebuilt through redemption. Rahman & Sons, a legacy of integrity." And in that quiet museum, under soft golden light, the story of two step-siblings once divided by ambition, united by forgiveness lived on, not in stone or paper, but in every honest trade that bore their name. The final chapter will bring closure to the generational saga, exploring how Rayan's twilight years defined the enduring spirit of the company, and how the lessons of integrity, forgiveness, and legacy are passed to the next generation. The decades rolled onward, gentle and unhurried, as if time itself had learned to respect the legacy of Rahman Sons International. The skyline of Al-Mazra had changed completely, where once the market lanes wound through dusty alleys. Now glass towers shimmered against the horizon. But, amid all that progress, the name Rahman Sons remained untouched, unchanged, standing firm like a monument built not from brick, but from truth. Rayan was now an old man. His hair had turned silver, his steps slower, but his presence still carried quiet authority. He no longer worked from the main headquarters. Instead, his office had moved to the Heritage Building, the original site of their family shop, preserved as both museum and symbol. He preferred it that way. The new corporate world of screens and stock reports felt distant, impersonal. But here, surrounded by old ledgers, wooden counters, and photographs of the past, he felt closer to the company's soul and to Alina. Every morning, he walked slowly through the small museum before sitting at his desk. He would pause before her photograph, the same one that had once hung above her office chair, and whisper a prayer for guidance. Then, he would open his worn leather notebook and begin writing not reports or memos, but reflections. Thoughts about business, ethics, leadership, and life. Over the years, those pages became his quiet testament, the book of lessons, as he called it privately. The company, now run by a new generation of leaders, had expanded beyond anything he or Alina could have imagined. Branches operated across continents. A global logistics network bore their insignia. University case studies spoke of their transformation from a family shop to a global institution. Yet, in every training manual, at the very front, one line remained constant: "We don't sell goods, we build trust." It was Alina's creed, now immortal. The new CEO, a young woman named Mariam, who had once been a scholarship recipient of the Alina Foundation, often visited Rayan for counsel. She saw him not merely as a founder but as a living archive of wisdom. One afternoon, she found him seated by the window, sunlight painting his lined face in amber hues. He greeted her with his usual calm smile and gestured for her to sit. She told him about an upcoming merger, about pressure from investors, about the temptation to compromise ethics for expansion. He listened quietly, hands folded. When she finished, he said, "Mariam, every generation faces that choice, the easy profit or the enduring principle. Choose the second, and you'll never lose the first." He handed her his leather notebook, the same one he had written in for years. "When you're unsure," he said softly, "read these pages. They're not rules, they're reminders." She accepted it with reverence, sensing that it was more than a gift. It was the final passing of the torch. After she left, Rayan remained by the window, watching the street where he and Alina once stood as rivals, as siblings, as guardians of the same dream. The noise of the city rose faintly through the glass, familiar yet distant. He thought of his father's smile, his stepmother's patience, Alina's unshakable strength. And for the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. In his final months, he visited the warehouse one last time. The workers there, some descendants of the original employees, greeted him with respect that bordered on affection. They still called him Sir Rayan, though he often insisted they simply call him Uncle. He watched the shipments being loaded, the same way he had decades ago, when everything was fragile and uncertain. The rhythm of industry, the creak of crates, the hum of forklifts felt like music to him. He left that day quietly, without ceremony, as though he knew it was the last time he'd hear that song. Weeks later, he passed away peacefully in his sleep, just as his sister had years before. The news spread across business networks, and tributes poured in from around the world. Newspapers remembered him as the redeemed founder, the man who turned his greatest mistake into a foundation for greatness. At his funeral, held in the same courtyard where his father's first shop once stood, employees from every branch gathered. Many had never met him, yet they felt they knew him through the stories, the principles, the quiet discipline that shaped their daily work. Marian stood before the crowd, holding the leather notebook. She read aloud from one of his final entries. Legacy is not built from victories, but from the lessons we leave behind. Forgiveness is the currency of endurance, and integrity the language of trust. If our name ever fades, let it fade clean, not corrupted by greed. Let every trade we make remind the world that honesty still has value. The words hung in the air like prayer. Years passed again, and the company continued to evolve. Its logo modernized, its systems automated, yet the moral DNA remained unchanged. Every new employee, before signing their contract, visited the Heritage Building where the story of Alina and Rayan was told through photographs, journals, and relics. The guides would end every tour the same way, leading visitors to the bronze plaque engraved with their legacy, founded on honesty, rebuilt through redemption. Children on school tours would often ask who they were, those two figures in the portraits, standing side by side. And the guide would answer, they were family not by blood, but by choice. One protected the truth, the other learned to live by it. In the evenings, when the museum lights dimmed and silence filled the hall, the wind from the old market streets would drift through the open window, carrying faint echoes of merchants calling, crates shifting, and the distant hum of commerce, the same sounds that had once defined their world. And somewhere in that eternal rhythm, the spirits of Alina and Rayan lived on, not as ghosts, but as principles embodied in every honest trade, every fair deal, every act of integrity that bore the seal of Rahman Sons. The company no longer belonged to them, it belonged to the generations who believed what they had proven true, that redemption could rebuild anything, that trust was stronger than wealth, and that the purest legacy was not ownership, but integrity. The signboard outside still bore the same words it had carried for nearly a century. Rahman and Sons, Est, 1983. We don't sell goods, we build trust. And beneath it, the word kept moving, buying, selling, growing, each transaction a quiet echo of two lives forever intertwined in the unbroken story of redemption, forgiveness, and enduring honor.